Our paper is titled Are China's 21st Century Neo-Mercantilist Trade Strategies in the Energy Sector a Global Security Threat? Presented by Christian Herzl and Alex Morrison. In an era defined by globalization, trade is becoming ever more important to a country's economic development. Different nations will naturally take different approaches to international trade. The two strategies that have dominated the discourse surrounding international trade are the contrasting theories of free trade and mercantilism. Defined as the theory that a nation accumulates wealth through exports and the accumulation of profitable balances, mercantilism aims to protect domestic industries by limiting foreign goods from entering the market. As China has risen to become the world's leading exporter, they become subject to numerous accusations surrounding their trade philosophies, including claims labeling them a currency manipulator and, more importantly, a global security threat in regards to their energy mercantilist tendencies. While some hold that China's behavior exhibits mercantilist tendencies indicative of a nation looking to seize global power, others believe that China's recent acquisitions of foreign oil supplies are more a sign that they are simply seeking to establish their own oil regime to serve their needs, independent from a system that historically has ignored them. The goal of our research is therefore to examine the implications of China's energy policies, which have tremendous ripple effects on the rest of the global economy. Now that we have defined mercantilism, we now turn to how this ideology came to be and how it has historically influenced trade policy. Over the past few centuries, economists have identified three broad phases of mercantilism, starting in 17th and 18th century Europe and continuing through to today. The classical mercantilist arguments stem from the desire to heighten one's nation above the rest, which ultimately required a great deal of capital. To obtain this capital, mercantilists reasoned that the best way to do so was by running a trade surplus achieved through the implementation of protectionist policies. The natural response to the mercantilist school of thought was a system of free trade, which soon overtook mercantilism as the dominant trade ideology. Free trade dominated the global trade discourse until a dramatic shift occurred after World War I, when many nations saw their economies collapse and attempted to stimulate domestic production through the implementation of more protectionist measures. The second wave of mercantilism, referred to as neo-mercantilism, was again eventually overtaken by free trade as the prevailing trade ideology, as influential economists made it difficult for politicians to justify protectionist policies. Despite the sound theoretical framework supporting free trade, the late stages of the 20th century saw mercantilist sentiment stick around, only this time not through blatant protectionist tariffs and quotas, but rather more subtle forms of mercantilism. Currency manipulation is one of these more subtle methods. The departure from the gold standard in 1971 made this possible, as countries now became able to strategically value their currencies to achieve mercantilist policy goals. By strategically undervaluing their nation's currency, mercantilist nations are able to avoid massive inflation that would inevitably result from running a trade surplus, a classic mercantilist method. Now turning to looking at the historical context of mercantilism in China. So China has been defined by rapid growth and transformation since the inception of its extensive reform process beginning in the late 70s. Now the second largest economy in the world, China has become increasingly interconnected with the rest of the globe. China's growth has largely been fueled by its emergence as the world's factory. Its massive population and low labor costs enable it to manufacture on a high scale, eventually becoming the largest exporter of goods in the globe. While the trade surplus that inevitably results from this large-scale exporting would typically result in a massive inflation of the Chinese yuan, China has been able to avoid this through the means of currency manipulation. While we could discuss in much greater depth the implications of Chinese currency manipulation as a means to achieve their mercantilist policy goals, it will not be the main focus of the study. China's historic rise has also presented a growing issue that the government must address: the sustainability of its growth. With the exception of coal, the scarcity of domestic energy to not only fuel its rapidly growing economy, but also support its massive population is intensifying. This issue is hardly a new one for China, however, as China has been attempting to address the issue of energy security for decades now. The 1980s and 90s saw China conduct cautious, market-oriented reforms throughout its energy sector, under which they emphasized the critical role of an open market and foreign direct investment in generating economic competitiveness and financial investment. This trend towards the liberalization of the energy industry took a sharp turn when the 1997 Asian financial crisis hit, leading China to the realization that it was vulnerable to the uncertainty surrounding the international oil market and liberalization of Western economies. In response to this crisis, China consolidated its state-run national oil companies to compete with those of Western nations. These NOCs now essentially have a monopoly on the Chinese energy market and are highly controlled by the Chinese government. One way that the neo-mercantilist nature of China's energy sector has become clear is in its relationship with Africa. Africa serves as the perfect trading partner for China as it is rich in the resources necessary for Chinese development, but lacks the funds necessary to stimulate its own growth, which can be provided by China. Trade deals with Africa, which should result in a mutually beneficial outcome, have often been anything but. Scholars note that China has taken advantage of Africa in a number of cases, consistently failing to deliver on their promises made to the continent while seizing a greater supply of the resources they originally demanded.